PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors of books about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk about the 6-day toxic smog event that killed 21 people in Donora, Pennsylvania in 1948. Our guest is Andy McPhee, author of the book Donora Death Fog, Clean Air, and the Tragedy of a Pennsylvania Mill Town.
This week on PA Books, Andy McPhee, author of Donora Death Fog.
Andy McPhee is the author of Donora Death Fog, Clean Air, and the Tragedy of a Pennsylvania Mill Town. Why did you write this book?
It's a story that needs to be told. I didn't know anything about it, and the more I learned about it in the beginning, the more I realized how consequential the events of the October weekend in 1948 were to the planet, and certainly to the country. So it was an important story, and it really hadn't been told in any kind of comprehensive way before. There had been a number of articles, and there was a chapter here and there in various books, but nothing comprehensive, and certainly nothing that provided any kind of historical context for the event. So the more I looked into it, just the importance struck me as critical for our understanding and for the air we breathe today.
How did you discover this incident?
Well, I didn't so much discover it as hear about it. My wife and I were huge fans of The Crown, the British TV series about Elizabeth II's life. And we were watching one night, it's the 4th episode, and the two serious-looking scientists got together, and one said, "Does the name Donora sound familiar to you?" And the other scientist said, "Donora." And the next thing, they're in Clement Attlee's office. He was a minister at the time, and saying the same thing to him, does the name Donora sound familiar? And then he began to explain that, yes, it was a mill town that suffered what they call an anticyclone, what we call a temperature inversion, which is what happens when we have fog. And he said, yes, it was in the south of, it was around Philadelphia, and they corrected him, no, it's Pittsburgh. And he said it killed a number of people. And I thought, what hold on here? I've never heard of this. I've been an environmentalist and very interested in the environment, have written about it for a number of years, since I was in high school, really. And I thought, how could I never have heard of this? So I began researching, and that's when I really learned about it. Now, the whole London fog, which is what they were talking about, London smog, in that show, was a different deal. That happened in 1952. But I began looking solely at Donora to try to understand more and to see if there was a book there. And sure enough, there was.
How did you do research for this? Is there, within the county or the city there, or are there documents, other types of items?
Well, the biggest help for research was by far the Donora Historical Society. Brian Charlton, who's a curator there and the historian, was enormously helpful in helping me to understand. They had a large library of documents in the back of the museum, as well as a number of documents, photographs, memorabilia that are displayed and continue to be displayed in the front part of the museum. And Brian was enormously helpful in pointing me here, pointing me there. So a great deal of it, that was a primary research right there. The other person who works with the Donora Historical Society, is Mark Pavelik. And Mark is just a fabulous, fabulous guy. And his information, he's a lifelong Donora resident. He has been talking to people about the smog and about Donora's history, just as Brian has, for many years. And his family has been in the area for a long, long time. So his insight and his knowledge of the area was absolutely invaluable to me. And in fact, Mark looked over every bit of the manuscript as I was developing it and would make corrections, say, no, that is in the south part rather than the mid part of Donora. And it was those kinds of insights that was very, very critical. Secondarily, there were any number of news reports in the local papers, but also in the national press that covered the story. And I can talk more about that in a bit. But the main research, the main articles that had really the most information about the people that were involved in the smog came from two authors, two writers. One was Burton Rucci, excuse me. He was a renowned writer for the New Yorker. And the other was Bill Davidson, who wrote for a number of newspapers, but wound up writing celebrity stories in Hollywood. And he also was very, very well known at the time. And they both did in-depth pieces on the smog, on the people, with times and locations, and that proved enormously helpful because the medical records at the time, other than what there was an investigation done later, and other than what those investigators found, primary medical records of the physicians in town, long gone. The town didn't want to hear about that. So a lot of the records were gone, never to be retrieved. So it was a lot of those two articles being so helpful, as well as the newspaper articles and all the other kinds of research that you do in the Library of Congress and newspapers.com, ancestry.com, those kinds of things.
Why do you think this incident isn't as well known today?
Well, there's several reasons, I think. In the immediate aftermath of the smog, there were a number of news stories, well, all around the country that picked it up. UPI, what we used to call UPI, United Press International, and AP ran stories, but they were very basic. There was a smog, it's a small town with mills, steel mills and zinc mills, very basic information. The town itself, and that was one of the things that fascinated me so much, was how the residents reacted. The town itself, for many, many, many years, for decades, didn't want to hear about it, didn't want to talk about it. As Brian Charlton, the historian at the Society, says, it was not something you wanted to list on your Chamber of Commerce's list of accomplishments. People didn't want to talk about it outside, and so there was never any, not that you would promote a deadly smog, but they didn't do much to get the word out either. There was an author, Deborah Davis, who's a well-known environmental epidemiologist, wrote a book with Donora as its sort of a focal point. She took a look at the first Donora as the first part of her book and the environmental impact there, then went on to talk about land and water pollution as well around the world. And it's an outstanding book. It's called When Smoke Ran Like Water, which uses Donora as a sort of stepping off point for the rest of her book. And that got a lot of traction in the environmental community, certainly, in the scientific community. But as far as the lay public goes, there hasn't been much. The Historical Society itself has done an outstanding job over the years of trying to explain the importance of the tragedy anyone who visited, particularly the Pittsburgh area newspapers and agencies, and they've done a remarkable job. But that has not translated to the rest of the country. Britain, and let's look at that for a moment. It's probably more well known since The Crown came out, and this was several years ago when that first season hit, that they learned about it. And it was in relation to the great, what they call the Great Smoke of London, the Great Smog of London in 1952. And they knew, the scientists in London knew and had evidence of all the investigatory efforts, not all of it, but a lot of it, that had been made in Donora, and the lessons that Donora had proved to us, and they paid no mind to it. And we don't pay enough mind to environmental disasters now. Right now, the biggest thing is a train derailment in Ohio, of course, but there remains air pollution throughout this country, particularly in the Mississippi Valley, Los Angeles. Around the world, there are numerous hotspots for air pollution, and we've cleaned the air, but nowhere near as much as we should have. And I think that sort of goes to Donora in a microcosm that not enough people know about it. It's sort of a microcosm, as I say, of how we are in the world. We don't pay enough attention to the things we really should be paying attention to.
Now, the incident that we're talking about took place in 1948, but before we get to that, let's go back in time a little bit to the town's founding and provide some historical context. Where does the name come from?
It's interesting. The founder of the town, in essence, was a man named William Donner, D-O-N-N-E-R, not the Donner Party Donner, but William Donner. And he had made his fortune really in tin plate in Ohio and Indiana. But he was looking to make a tin plate plant in Pennsylvania and looked at Monessen, which is the town south of Donora. And Donner worked with Andrew Mellon, both of the Mellon brothers, mostly though with Andrew. And the name is an amalgam of Donner and Andrew Mellon's first wife, Nora, together, Donora. It's the only town named Donora in the world, still to this day, as far as I can determine. There's a town in Italy that's very close, but it's not quite the same. Donori, I believe it is, Donoro. And it just came from the melding of those two names. And while I'm on the subject of melding, apparently they did that a lot then. Monessen, which is, again, the town south, and also was a steel tin plate mill town, got its name from the Monongahela and a town in Germany, steel-making town in Germany called Essen. Now, they wanted to make the town's name Essen to begin with, but there was already a town, Essen. So they said, well, let's do Essen on the Monongahela, hence Monessen. So they did that a lot in that cramped little valley.
Why was that particular location chosen to put these mills?
Several reasons. First of all, it was on a river. Transportation to and from Pittsburgh and to and from West Virginia and southern parts of Pennsylvania, which were rich in coal, was critical. They wanted to be able to get the coal up. Coal is a primary ingredient of steel. It's coal, iron ore, and limestone. And there are limestone quarries as well south of Donora. Second, it wasn't far from Pittsburgh, but it was sort of out of Pittsburgh's line of fire. Donner wanted to make a town on its own, not dependent on any other town. He wanted the residents in town to work at the mill and then to buy products within the town, a self-enclosed area, so to speak. And he found that in this town of West Columbia, it was called very early on. This is in the turn of the 20th century. It's a horseshoe curved. The Monongahela flows north, as everyone in Pittsburgh knows. And this horseshoe curve would allow ships to pass, tugboats really being pulled, tugboats pulling coal, and a landing spot. There would be a train that ran through Donora. So the transportation was a big issue. Also at the time, Webster itself, across the river from Donora, had coal-making plants already. And they had coal tipples right along the river. Coal tipple being something you put coal in, and you can shoot it down a chute and into a truck or a train or a barge or whatever it was you had. So the location was very amenable to a large area of mills, and we're talking dozens and dozens of buildings. The zinc mill alone consisted of 59 buildings. In any case, there were no homes there. He looked at this expanse of land at the end of this horseshoe like a thumb and thought, I can build mills here, and there's room enough for houses, and there's room enough for a main street that people can shop on. And so that's where he decided to go. He bought land around the whole area, he and Andrew Mellon, all of the farms, and there weren't very many. We're talking about a dozen or so people at the turn of the century in 1898, which was when he first started buying land. And by 1901, he's got much of the town already built, many, many homes. 1900, they had a land grab. They'd advertise, listen, if you want to come to Donora and work in the mills, you can get a house. You just have to come this morning. It was an August morning, and the gun went off, and everybody made their way to the land offices who gave out plots of land. Fascinating time, I think, in that period. So the land itself was made just because Donora wanted a steel mill there. Then towns arose that way. Pittsburgh grew so much because of the Mellon brothers, because of George Westinghouse, and some of the other hugely wealthy businessmen who built that area up with their plants and mills and whatnot. So Donner, who is not truly a robber baron, he never had that much money. He had a lot of money, but not as much as either of the Mellons, certainly not as much as Rockefeller and those kinds of folks. But he did pretty well. But he wanted to have his own land. He wanted to prove himself to an extent. And so Donora came into the mix, and he made that town.
Now you mentioned the zinc mill. Can you talk more about zinc? What is zinc used for in the steelmaking process?
Yes. Steel is fabulous, but when it's exposed to air, a layer of iron oxide can form, and does form. And the iron oxide leads to rust. Zinc also binds to steel, zinc oxide, and it prevents iron oxide from binding, or other agents for that matter. And so zinc has been for a long time used as a galvanizing agent. It was used to make brass as well in the ancient times, but really zinc for our purposes, not medicinal purposes, that's different, but for industrial purposes, zinc really has been primarily used as a galvanizing agent. Certainly was in those days. World War I was coming up. All the businessmen throughout America, and certainly Mellon and Donner and those folks, could see that war was probably imminent. and probably unavoidable. And of course, it proved to be so. And they knew that all the military, the whole complex, would need to prevent rust in its tanks and rifles and helmets, canteens, everything. And so they looked to zinc to galvanize to prevent those items from rusting. GI initially comes from galvanized iron. It's not a government issue. That came later. But the zinc works, when it was built, and it was built in 1915, became immediately the largest zinc processing plant in the world and continued to be so for a number of years. The zinc works was the last set of mills to be built in the town. It's at the north end. The complex was in the north end of town. And as soon as the zinc mill was built, that's really when the whole area began to change. But let me go back to zinc. Zinc process is much different than steel making. It's a brutal process. It certainly was throughout the first half of the 20th century. Brutal on the workers, on the office people. The toxins that came out of the zinc works, cadmium, zinc oxide, sulfur dioxide, sulfur monoxide, carbon monoxide, those are very dangerous chemicals. And the zinc works by far put out more toxins really than the steel mills and the iron works, the wire works. When I talk about steel mills, it's really the steel and wire works, the American Steel and Wire. That was the main company, and they made barbed wire and fencing of all kinds, steel sheets and everything from sheets for toasters to rods for highways. So that was all at the steel plant. The zinc plant really just made zinc and zinc products initially for the war, but it continued, of course, throughout the first half of the century.
Now, you say in the book, you talk about these toxic gases that are released in this process. And you say that they're just in the building and they collect in different parts of the building. Were there any safety regulations or ventilation processes that would have helped the workers in that environment?
The safety processes and procedures and mechanisms that we think of today, not even close. They consisted to a fair degree. Yes, there was ventilation, but it never really worked. They consisted to a fair degree of making sure that the workers are telling the workers not to do certain things. Don't be there. And I'll tell you a story that they tell at the Cary blast furnaces. And I hope I get this right. There is an area in the Cary blast furnaces, just as there was in the Donora blast furnaces, where if you stand too long between these huge furnaces, if you stand there too long, more than a minute or so, you pass out from basically asphyxiation. If you stand there for longer than that, you can die. And other workers so they'd have like a minute in there, and then they'd have to come back out. And many workers apparently died in that area, and other workers who went in to save them died. It was that kind of thing. Even, as I say, for the offices in the zinc works, it wasn't like, especially in the winter, you couldn't leave the windows open. You couldn't really leave the doors open, although they certainly did. The gases were so they're so dense within the plant. I have a photo in the book of a smelter operation, and there's a man standing by the smelters, and out of the smelters, it looks like it's just smoke, white smoke pouring forth. But of course, it's not white smoke. It's a smoke filled with toxins of all kinds. Carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide are very, very heavy. Sulfurs, all the sulfur oxides are very heavy. Cadmium, lead, these are zinc oxides. These are highly toxic chemicals that we now know and how dangerous they are. And that was part of the saving grace of Donora, actually. It made us pay attention to what those toxins were. It said, okay, to the government, you better do something about this. But back then, it was just part of the deal. It was the zinc jitters. Workers in the zinc mill would often come down with headache, lethargy, like the flu. And they would go home Friday at the end of their work week, and over the weekend feel much better. Monday morning, go back to work, feel lousy again. It's called a Monday morning fever, or zinc jitters, and it was all from the toxins that their bodies were suffering. It's a horrible place for that kind of thing. But the steel mill also put out a bunch of stuff. The blast furnaces, they all emanated huge quantities of toxins, hundreds of thousands of pounds a day, if you looked at it.
You write about how these toxic gases killed all the vegetation in the town, the grasses and shrubs, and what kind of an effect did that have on the community?
That was fascinating. It had not just ecological effects, but as soon as Webster was a thriving community. People from Pittsburgh would drive or train down to the Webster area and frolic. It was really a lovely town with hotels and restaurants and all kinds of things to do along the water. As soon as they got wind that the steel mill was coming, the richer residents, the more wealthy residents of Webster left. And that was fine. For a while, the steel mill went up and the blast furnaces went up, and then many Websterites went to work at the mills. Then the zinc works came. The zinc works changed everything. The cadmium and zinc oxides were carried on the mostly easterly winds across the river to Webster. And there in Webster, decimated the vegetation. The Webster hillside became nothing but dirt and rocks. And there are photos that I have in the book, but also you can find that it looks like a desert almost on a hill. Donora also suffered that fate, but Donora was a little bit more fortunate in that it was packed with houses and streets and sidewalks. So there wasn't a whole lot of grass to kill. Toward more the top of the hill, yes, it killed the vegetation up there. But again, nothing as bad as Webster. And it wasn't just vegetation. Cows, any animal, pigs, anything that they were growing in the farms, the crops that they tried to plant, nothing would grow. The people in the Webster and in Donora as well, had to clean their homes basically top to bottom every week. Clean their curtains, wash off their porch, because the grime within a week had built up so much that it would turn a white house to gray in a week. And the house itself you really couldn't keep clean. It would grime up the curtains, the linens in the bedroom, the doilies on the cupboards and whatnot, would turn soot. Cleaning constantly. It was a constant regimen. And imagine what if that was the case, if they were cleaning their doilies and their tablecloths and their curtains, what was going in their lungs, all at the same time, inside the house. It couldn't be escaped. So it had an enormous toll on the vegetation, the wildlife, and the humans. And within a few short years, Webster had turned from a thriving vacation community to a desolate place with a few hardy souls hanging around. And that's basically what it is today, I'm sorry to say.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, in the book, you also talk about, in the zinc mill itself, the heat and the effect of the heat on the workers. What would it have been like to be actually working in that mill?
The zinc mill was not alone in the heat. They all had tremendous levels of heat, but the zinc mill was perhaps the worst. Particularly, there are two areas. One is called the roaster, but it doesn't make any difference. The heat was just tremendous. Anyone working in the roaster or in these other places, they could not wear any metal on their bodies. I have jeans on today, and they have little, with a little metal, what do you call them?
The rivets?
Rivets, thank you very much, the little rivets. So they couldn't wear jeans or pants with rivets because the rivets would burn their skin. A belt with a metal buckle would burn their skin. They couldn't wear leather-soled shoes, because it would burn their skin. The soles would burn right off. So it was an enormously difficult place to work. Many of the workers in the zinc mill could work only 4 hours a day. That's all they were allowed to work. Then they got sent home because it was so horrible. I can't really even imagine the amount of heat. I tried to, but I know I didn't do it justice. We're talking about people who survived, who worked in constantly heat far worse than any desert in the southwest U.S. Constant, tremendously high heat. And those jobs actually, epidemiologists call it basically self-selection. If you weren't able to stand the heat, you had to get out of the kitchen. So if a job in the mill, steel mill or the zinc mill or the blast furnaces required you to be near these insanely hot temperatures, and you just couldn't take it, you were moved elsewhere. You were moved to the trains, wherever else in the mill that you could work, in the wire plant, but you couldn't work there. So the ones who could work there just kind of stayed because they could stand it. And those people obviously suffered the worst, generally the worst accidents. Burns were extremely common, and you were expected to come back to work. You go to the mill hospital and then come back. Worst case, come back tomorrow. The workers were basically treated like chattel, and I suppose you had to an extent. Somebody had to work those mills, and somebody had to work in those enormously difficult, toxic, hot, extremely hot environments. So it had to be done. And of course, all of the products that came out of that, we made it through World War I and later through World War II because of the galvanized products that came not just from Donora, but certainly from Donora is one of them. And the steel that was made and used in the world wars, that's where it came from. And those men, and they were almost all men. Some women worked outside those areas, but men worked inside them. They suffered the greatest consequences of those work environments. But the heat is just ungodly. In one of them, let me give you a quick example. It's called the roaster. And in the roaster, the hot heated ore, slag and whatnot, there's like a turnstile that raked, basically, that would stir up this pan of enormously hot metal. And someone would have to go in, usually a young man, with a sort of a rake, and as an arm of this mechanism went by, they would have to reach in and rake the substances, the metals, the ores, and then get out while another arm came by. That, I can't even imagine being right there at the opening, 1,600 degrees, ovens basically, and you're stirring them. Insane. The roaster was basically hell on earth, or hell itself, really, if you think of it that way.
Well, the incident that is at the center of your book, it took place in October 1948. What happened? When the people started noticing things going wrong, what was the environment like?
People didn't start noticing what was going on until Saturday evening, when Walter Winchell, as a former mayor once said, opened up his big mouth. Let me take you from the beginning of the smog. It started on a Tuesday. What happened was there was a temperature inversion in the valley. Temperature inversion, warm air sits over cooler air at the surface, and it puts like a cap on it. And generally that warm air blows off as the Earth's surface heats up, and as we say it, the fog blows off. Well, this fog didn't blow off because the smoke was omnipresent in Donora and Webster. It was always there. So it was not a big deal to have, a smoky Tuesday. But there was no wind. The valley has steep walls on either side, and it's a horseshoe-shaped curve, so the ends are pretty much sealed off as well. Wednesday comes along, and the smoke is a little thicker. Nobody thinks anything of it. They have thick fog all the time. Thursday comes along, it's thicker still. Friday now, we're talking about a real mess. It's very, very thick. People are beginning to cough and complain and have trouble breathing. But there's a Halloween parade Friday night, Friday afternoon, that they plan for. People come out for it. They line the streets. They can't really even make out the people in the middle of the street walking by in the parade. One young girl had a flashlight her father had rigged up for her little princess costume, and they could see a light as she walked by. She wound up winning the contest for that age group, probably because of the flashlight. But they couldn't see. And so once the parade finished, the streets emptied almost immediately. Saturday, there's a game. Now, Friday night, in the middle of the night, that's when people started to die. Really, we could talk Saturday morning very, very early. That's when people started to die. Who knew about it? Well, the funeral home directors did. The firefighters began to hear about it. The hospital began to get patients. And that's about it. Saturday morning comes and there's a football game in the afternoon, and people are getting ready for the football game. And it goes off at 1 o'clock, the top of the field, the top of the hill in Donora. It's against Monongahela. They are arch rivals. Donora at the time had a hugely winning team. The Donora Dragons were, boy, when you're going up against the Donora Dragons, you're going to get hit pretty hard. These are tough kids. The Wildcats came down and had a pretty easy time with it. Game was 27-7. People's recollections vary about that game. Some said they could see the ball clearly in the players. Others said you couldn't hardly see anything on the field. You could hear them kick it, and you could hear screaming from the other side, but you couldn't really see much. Recollections vary. All throughout Saturday evening, Saturday night, people died. Walter Winchell, finally on his show, said that there are people dropping dead from the smoke and from the fog in Donora, and it's that the phones that had been ringing pretty solidly between physicians and patients, trying to get their physicians, between the hospital and physicians and ambulance drivers and fire departments. Once Winchell made that announcement, nationwide announcement, phone lines exploded. Everybody wanted to know how their relatives were in Donora, what was going on. Many people couldn't get through. The people in Donora really didn't realize how bad this fog was because they had lived through so many of them. Some parents didn't let their kids go out to trick-or-treating because there was just too much. They were coughing. So they'd say, well, come on back home. And they didn't think much of it. Once Walter Winchell came out and said, oh, gee, I guess maybe something is bad happening. I wonder what it is. The Mills blamed it on God. It was an act of God because it had to do with the weather. Now, the Mills had been checking their stacks starting with Friday night. And this checking the stacks was going outside and see where the smoke was going. And it tended to go in a north or northeast direction, which was probably it wasn't so much wind as it probably was hitting the ceiling and sort of bending one direction or another. So I didn't think much of it, and I thought, well, this is pretty normal. And that was the consensus of the town until someone they knew died or became so sick. And so what you see is from Saturday morning very early through late Saturday night, and a large number of people, far more than Donora had ever experienced before, dying. And there wasn't much they could do about it. The physicians, and I'll talk about the physicians now if that's okay. All the physicians in town really got to work, all the ones who were there. And they went around with their adrenaline, with their theophylline, which is they both open up the airways and help people breathe better. And the adrenaline shots, which we call epinephrine now, that doesn't last very long. The effects of that doesn't last very long. It's pretty much gone from the body within a couple of hours. Theophylline lasts longer. Aminophylline, some people may be more familiar with, certainly lasts longer, but not more than 4, 5, 6 hours. So these people were given temporary relief. The firefighters brought along oxygen tanks and would give residents a shot of oxygen, put them under a hood, a sheet or a blanket or something, and give like an oxygen tent, a makeshift oxygen tent at home, and give them a few minutes of oxygen there. Extraordinarily brief periods of relief. But those brief periods apparently saved, we don't know how many lives. We're thankful it only lost the 21. So that was a tough weekend. And as I say, people really didn't pay much attention to it. And that has lasted up and really until present. I interviewed people who believed to their dying day that the only people who died were the ones who, they were sick to begin with. So it was really their fault. I was very strong. I walked up and down the hills every day, which is what they did. They'd walk down the hill to work, up the hill for lunch, down the hill for work, up the hill to go home, down the hill to go shopping, go back up with their groceries and whatever. They were constantly walking these pretty steep hills. So I was okay because I was in shape, but they just weren't. They just couldn't handle it. That attitude pervaded a number of people's entire psyches for decades. Fascinating occurrence. It's a rationalization and denial embedded to the core, not blaming the Mills for that tragedy.
Was there an investigation afterwards?
There were several investigations, the most prominent of which was done by the United States Public Health Service, run by a physician named James Townsend. It was a fairly significant investigation. Nurses came out and interviewed hundreds of patients. They gathered death certificates and whatever information they could find on the victims. They did 3 autopsies on the victims, which wasn't enough. They tried to duplicate the smog effects on the hills and the town, but of course they couldn't because it was impossible to do. So they did the best job they could, and a great deal of information came out of that investigation. That investigation was then passed not just to London scientists, but all over the place. But that investigation yielded virtually no change. The recommendations that they wrote about had no teeth. They continued to blame the weather, that there were so many causes of the effluence of the toxins in the air, including smoking, including the great number of coal stoves that were in homes throughout Donora and Webster. And they just couldn't pinpoint the major contributors to the deaths, which is unfortunate because one of the physicians, William Rongus, is certainly the most outspoken and perhaps the only outspoken physician, said, no, this is all because this is the zinc mill. These are the steel mills and the zinc mill. That's what's causing these deaths. And he had a tough time of it. So yeah, there were investigations. There was supposed to be, and that was a preliminary report, the public health system. They never did a follow-up. There was a 10-year sort of a follow-up, which looked at death rates, but the conclusions were much the same. They couldn't pinpoint any cause any specific cause, and as a result, really nothing happened. The only way we got change is because Harry Truman was about to be president. The election was just days away. The smog cleared on October 31st, Halloween Day, 1948. And just a few days later was the election when Truman won over Dewey. So that was one of the first things that landed on his desk was, what are we going to do about Donora? And he wound up calling a first ever conference on air pollution that led directly to the first anti-pollution legislation that the country had ever had. It was called the Anti-Pollution Control Act of 1955, and that's when things began to change.
Now, the zinc mill itself, you mentioned, closed in 1957, and the steel mills about a decade later. Has
Yes.
Donora recovered from not having all these pollutants in the community?
No, the wildlife has certainly recovered, and the plant life has absolutely recovered. That recovered within a few years. There were grass and shrubs, and now there are trees. And the hillside in Webster is forested. There are homes, absolutely, but it's really mostly forested. And the Donora hillsides came back as well. Yeah, people are breathing much easier, absolutely. Webster, however, and Donora, certainly, neither of them have recovered. Webster's probably the worst off, but it's also a much smaller community. But Donora has never recovered. And it wasn't just the mills, although that was the main part of it. Things began to change in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And Donora found it difficult to attract new businesses to a little horseshoe-shaped curve, which was kind of difficult to get to. You have to look at the landscape and the roads and whatnot. And right now, it's an exit off the Stan Musial Bridge. And today, the town does not have a bank. It does not have its own grocery store, other than like a mini mart. It has a couple of restaurants that have been around a long time, actually, but most of the buildings are empty. There's no movie theater. None of those kinds of things that really make a community a community. The library is doing very well. The Donora Historical Society takes people in or treats people to lessons about Donora from around the world. Every week, they're open on weekends, and they work closely with some of the organizations in Pittsburgh and to teach people who really want to hear about it. And there are former Donora residents or children of former Donora residents around the country who still look at Donora as their hometown and still look out for news about that place. But the town itself, they're trying, but boy, it's a tough road to hoe. It's basically a bedroom community. People commute elsewhere.
Now, you've worked as a registered nurse. When you were researching this and reading about what was going on in the hospitals, what did you think?
I understood what the hospitals must have been going through, and that was one of the things that attracted me to this story. I was a nurse for a long time, and I was in healthcare writing and editing and publishing for a great many years as well. So I understood what it must have been like. I think I did anyway, because I used to work in a busy emergency room, and I know what a crazy house an emergency room and an intensive care unit can be. The hospital was the closest hospital was at the time was called Charleroi Monessen Hospital. It's now called Mon Valley Hospital, and it was just deluged with patients. They didn't have enough oxygen tents to handle the patients, but they did the best they could. But the clamor and the chaos that must have been present in that small community hospital had to be intense. People would come in, their clothes sooty, so you had that smell. They smoking cigarettes, of course, you had that smell. You had the smell of alcohol and all the regular hospital smells that you might have had. It had to be intense. Physicians and technicians and aides and nurses running back and forth, administrative people trying to keep everything straight. Huge, a fracas, just chaotic. But they did okay. They had the last victim, actually. The last victim died, a direct victim of the smog, died in just before Christmas. Epidemiologists and environmentalists generally give a window of about 60 days after an event like this to count victims of that event. And so that's how we wound up with 21, although 20 was the main number for a great many years. But yeah, the hospital must have been insane. And so I've ridden ambulances as well, and I know what that's like. So I tried to imagine what it was like for those people back at that time when we didn't have cell phones. They had a couple of radios they would communicate with, but that was about it. So it was just chaotic with complications and situations that we never would think of today that they had to overcome. By sheer will and creativity.
Now, you had talked about how many of the residents in the town either didn't know what was going on or didn't think that it was a huge thing, different from what they had experienced in the past. But was that different in the hospitals? Was there more of a sense of crisis in the hospitals themselves?
Well, from what we can understand, yeah, the hospital certainly must have known that something was going on in that valley, because the hospital itself was located on the other side of the hill, the south end. So they weren't getting any of that smoke. They would get some, and it was foggy. So they must have known something was coming off, and it was just, but they had no time really to think about it. It was only later, the same with everybody else, that they realized that this was bad. But as I say, I'm not sure that many got transported really until Saturday night. And by that time, the problem was that the roads in town were almost impassable. The firefighters talked about how they would have to crawl from one street lamp to the next, holding along the gutter of the road, the sidewalk, trying to figure out where they were and to work their way along. Driving then, even for an ambulance, was nigh near impossible. One of the funeral home directors in town, one of the morticians, Rudolf Schwerha, he made a number of trips, and most of the residents in the area were taken care of by his funeral home. He had to have his driver walk out in front and feel his way along. So how many the hospital got, and the records are gone, I'm sorry to say, but how many the hospital got over Saturday is not really sure, but they were certainly inundated by Saturday afternoon and evening, perhaps mostly by people at the southern end of town who were able to escape or who were able, for what other reason, to walk there. It must have been terrible. But yeah, they knew something was going on, just as the firefighters did, but they just didn't know what or why at that time.
And we only have a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to ask about the management of the mills. Did they ever accept responsibility, or how did they respond to this emergency?
No, it was always an act of God. They've never accepted responsibility to this day. They don't allow any of those records to be released to the public, despite FIOA requests. I didn't submit those, but Deborah Davis submitted, I don't know how many she did, dozens probably. They just don't release it. And of course, many of the records, most of the records I would say, are just not around. So either for U.S. Steel's records, they are either locked away someplace or they were destroyed, perhaps by accident, a fire perhaps, or whatever, perhaps purposely, we don't know. But they have never accepted blame. All of the cases that were brought against the company were settled out of court. None of them went to court. And the settlements were tiny, a couple of $1,000 in one case, $1,776, $75 for the Donora family. And Susan Donora was one of the victims, which wound up being about $267 for each of the children, which was enough to buy an RCA television back then with a little bit left over. So the steel mills never accepted responsibility to this day.
Well, we've been speaking with Andy McPhee. He is the author of Donora Death Fog, Clean Air, and the Tragedy of a Pennsylvania Mill Town. Andy, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Phil. Appreciate it.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.